The Desire of Professor Wu by Li Jiateng. Translated by Nicholas Koss. Professor Wu is a person who attracts other people to him. He always welcomes others with a smile and rarely says anything to cause the other person to be unhappy. But recently, I've detected that sometimes all of a sudden he looks uncomfortable, but this look quickly disappears. The first time I noticed this uncomfortable look was when we were holding a college faculty council. Professor Wu was sitting opposite to me. As the dean of our college was reprimanding us in a long sermon, Professor Wu suddenly had a look of uncomfortableness. Even though it was just for a second, I noticed it. Another time was when Professor Wu and I had just finished playing tennis. As we were walking to the parking lot, that look again appeared. This time, I straightforwardly asked Professor Wu what was going on. He explained to me that for about 2 years now, he would suddenly have a headache. He had gone to all kinds of doctors and had been through every type of examination, but no problem could be found. Professor Wu knew that it would be very difficult to find the cause for his illness, because whenever he went to the hospital, he would be feeling fine. So how could a doctor find a cause? I asked him if the headache would awaken him while he was sleeping during the night. He said no. I then asked if he had a headache while exercising. He said he didn't seem to. Professor Wu had been a Little League baseball champion and was quite accomplished in sports. He excelled in every sport and would exercise whenever he had free time. It was obvious that his headache should have no relationship with his beloved sports. I decided to help Professor Wu solve this puzzle. I gave him a little tape recorder and asked him to carry it with him during the day. As soon as he had pain in his head, he should use the tape recorder and describe his surroundings. I asked him then to collect and edit his recordings and give them to me. I would analyze them. 3 months later, Professor Wu gave me a tape. I listened to the tape again and again, and discovered that each time before he had the pain, indeed someone had done something. And this was something very ordinary. For other people, this was nothing of any consequence. But Professor Wu was very sensitive to this thing. Of course, he was not aware of his sensitivity in this regard. I decided to do a follow-up on my investigation. I knew that his headache was a problem that had occurred during the last 2 years. Moreover, it was only in the last 2 years that Professor Wu was working in our school. I also knew that before coming to our school to teach, he had worked at a refugee camp in Africa. But it was rare for him to speak to us about his experiences in Africa. I also knew that Professor Wu had the habit of keeping a diary, so there should be a diary from when he was at the refugee camp. I asked him if I could get that diary. He was hesitant at first, but eventually he gave it to me. After I got the diary, I started to read it carefully. At last, I could make sense of his situation. Now it was my turn to find him the right medicine for his illness. One day, Professor Wu and I went to the National Science Council for a meeting. Driving back, I saw that he had fallen asleep. I then, unbeknownst to him, drove to an orphanage with which I was very familiar. There was a 3-year-old boy there who was very cute and who loved to be hugged. Every time I went there, he wanted me to hug him. As soon as I got out of the car, he ran over to be hugged. As I was hugging him, he noticed Professor Wu, who was both young and lovable. The little devil, seeing another possibility, changed his mind and extended his hands so as to be hugged by Professor Wu. But Professor Wu all of a sudden became very nervous, and it seemed he did not want to do this. But there were many people looking at him, so he had to overcome his hesitancy and hug this cute little child. The little boy did not experience Professor Wu's uncomfortableness and tightly hugged him, placing his head near Professor Wu's shoulders in a most relaxed and satisfied fashion. The nervousness of Professor Wu slowly disappeared, and he moved away from me while hugging the child. I noticed that he took off his glasses, and I knew the reason why. Tears were pouring forth. As we drove back, Professor Wu did not have much to say and seemed to be recalling something, yet he appeared to be very peaceful. Later on, I introduced Professor Wu to do volunteer work at a halfway house, which had some youngsters who had gotten on the wrong track. These young people worshipped Professor Wu. He was well educated and could also play baseball, and he was a good swimmer too. Overnight, he became their hero. If they had any problems, they would tell him. Professor Wu knew he was no expert in counseling, so he didn't respond recklessly. But at least he provided a channel for these youngsters to talk from their heart. Professor Wu continued to carry his tape recorder. After another 3 months, he came and told me that he was going to give me an empty tape because he no longer knew what a headache was. Originally, when I had heard Professor Wu's tape, I discovered that each time before he had a headache, there had been someone coughing. Even though it was a very light cough, he had still heard it. He only had to hear the sound of coughing to experience the pain. I then remembered that the time when we were at a meeting and our great dean was sermonizing, our dean indeed did cough once. Afterwards, I did an experiment. When I was near Professor Wu, I surreptitiously coughed, and as to be expected, he had a headache. Why was it that he was so sensitive to a cough? As already mentioned, I knew that Professor Wu had been to Africa. Unexpectedly, in his diary that he had allowed me to read, I discovered a terrifying experience. He had looked after a refugee boy who had died in his arms. Before his death, that little boy had coughed uncontrollably. Professor Wu had recorded this event in his diary very clearly. I further noticed that this brought the diary of his stay in Africa to an end. Afterwards, he wrote no more. Clearly, Professor Wu had suffered a very serious psychological wound. At the university, Professor Wu had all along been a member of the Kids Club and had really enjoyed being with kids. After his African experience, he was afraid to be with kids and did not continue this volunteer work. But his trying to escape from doing good work only made him have a guilty conscience, and even more, made him sensitive to a cough. When that cute little kid hugged him, he suddenly experienced again how happy he was looking after youngsters. And so he returned to his life of doing volunteer work and made himself realize that he was still a good person. He was no longer sensitive to a cough. Professor Wu later told me that when he went to work that morning in Africa, the seriously ill boy, before he passed away, had wanted Professor Wu to hug him. The boy was already as thin as a stick. Professor Wu had no idea that the boy would want to hug him tightly for 2 hours. His cough became fainter and fainter. The strength of his hugging weaker and weaker. By the time the boy had left this world, Professor Wu had already completely collapsed. Professor Wu asked me, "If someone, before he died, was tightly hugging you, could you endure it?" He also told me that since that little boy had died while holding him tightly, he had never again dared to hug a child. Even his sister's children he did not dare hug. His family members thought he was acting strangely, but they did not understand why. He himself thought he was pitiful, since when he saw a lovable child, he did not dare hug him. Professor Wu also told me that he had one desire: to help others. When he was in college, he had a very full life all the time. It was not because he was able to enter college because he could play sports, but it was because he participated in all kinds of service-related clubs, which allowed his desire to help to be fulfilled. His trip to Africa brought to an end his volunteer work. He said that he became someone whose desire was repressed, and it was this kind of repression that made him feel so terribly pained. It was because he thought that he was not doing anything good himself and was not a good person that this guilt of not doing any good things made him so sensitive to a cough. After Professor Wu had held the little boy in the orphanage, he once again experienced the happiness of loving another person and decided to return to volunteer work. At that moment, he discovered that he was not a bad person. He still was a person who wanted to help others, and his desire to do so was finally again fulfilled. There was no more headache. After I heard Professor Wu's theory of desire, I realized that a person with that kind of desire was not only he himself. If someone would stop me from helping children with their homework, stop me from visiting sick people or people in jail, would not permit me to comfort high school students who had not passed the entrance examination for college, or even would stop me from holding a child, my life too would be miserable. Last week, when I was doing volunteer work at the orphanage, that lovable boy was making a scene while hanging on to me. As I was thinking how to get him to go to someone else, 5 male college students appeared who had come to bring some donations. When they saw this boy, they each wanted to hug him. After the little devil sized up the 5 of them, he selected one. That big college student expressed his happiness, and the others could not conceal their disappointment. We often think that desire is not something good, and frequently hear teachers tell students to control their desires. Professor Wu, however, is right. We all have a subconscious desire to love others, to be concerned about others, and to do something good. If this desire cannot be fulfilled, we will not be happy. Professor Wu is such a good example.